orange. Sun was sinking fast behind the Montana prairie, painting the whole sky in shades of fire. Collar. On the porch of the old Circle M ranch house, a glass sat on the wooden railing, half full of sweet tea with condensation dripping slowly down its sides. A single honeybee crawled along the rim, too tired or too determined to give up. Inside the bunkhouse kitchen, Margaret Smith Maggie, to everyone who knew her, wiped the same glass for the third time. At 63 years old, her hands had forgotten how to be still. They curled from decades of mending fences, pulling calves during spring births, and holding on to things that wanted to slip away. The kitchen clock read 7:42 p.m. on that Tuesday evening, September 12, 2023. Through the screen door, she could see him, the new hand she'd hired just 2 weeks back. Silas Jones. He'd said he'd come up from Texas, though he didn't talk like it. Sat on the bottom step of the porch, a pocket knife in one hand and a chunk of pine in the other. Curls of wood fell around his boots like small promises. Hadn't spoken more than 20 words since breakfast. Maggie set the glass down and pressed her palm flat against the cool counter. Something had felt wrong all day. Not loud wrong, not obvious wrong, just a quiet hum in the back of her mind. Like when the cattle get restless before a storm, the barometer hasn't caught yet. She'd checked the front door lock 3 times since lunch, twice more than usual. The bee on the glass finally gave up and flew off toward the wildflowers growing by the barn. Maggie watched it go and wished for a second she could follow it somewhere simple. Silas stopped whittling. He didn't stand up, didn't turn his head. Jet stopped moving altogether, the knife frozen mid-stroke against the wood. His eyes weren't on the sunset anymore. They were fixed on the far tree line, a mile east, where the cottonwoods marked the boundary line of her property. Maggie's chest tightened. She'd seen that kind of stillness before, back when her husband Jack was alive, and they'd had trouble with men who thought a woman alone couldn't hold on to 160 acres of good grazing land. The kitchen smelled like the stew she'd had simmering since noon, carrots and beef and the last of the onions from her garden. Vet's smell had been her comfort for 3 years, ever since the funeral where they'd laid Jack in the small cemetery plot behind the old barn. But tonight, even that familiar scent couldn't settle her nerves. She wiped her hands on her jeans and moved toward the screen door. That's when the wind shifted. It came from the east, carrying dust and the memory of heat, and underneath it, something else. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. The high, thin whine of an engine revving hard, then cutting off sudden like a voice choked mid-sentence. Silas heard it too, his head tilted just slightly. Tracking it, Maggie pushed through the screen door and stepped onto the porch. The wood planks were warm under her bare feet, still holding the day's heat. She opened her mouth to ask him about the stew, needed to hear her own voice. Needed something ordinary to hold on to. The screen door slammed behind her. The sound cracked through the evening air like a branch-breaking dot, and then she saw them. 3 sets of headlights at the far end of the half-mile driveway. Borings, bouncing hard over the rutted gravel, slashing through the fading light like knives through cloth. Too fast. Coming way too fast. Nobody drove that road like that unless they meant to make a statement. Maggie's hand flew to her throat. Her pulse beat against her palm so hard she could count every thump without trying. The air left her lungs, just vanished. She stood there with her mouth slightly open, pulling at nothing. Silas rose slowly from the step. His left knee popped, that same sound he made every time he stood up. Ordinary and human, and somehow grounding in this moment that felt less and less real. Set the piece of pine down on the step, careful like, as if he might come back to it later. 2. The knife went down beside it. Metal clicking soft against wood. He didn't look at the trucks. He looked at her. The trucks kept coming. Headlights cutting through the dusk. Engines growling loud now, no longer trying to hide. Gravel sprayed behind them, pinging off metal and disappearing into the dark. A muscle jumped in Silas's jaw. Just once, a quick twitch beneath skin weathered by too many summers in too many places. Maggie grabbed his arm before she knew what she was doing. Her fingernails, still carrying a little dirt from the morning's weeding, pressed into the fabric of his denim jacket. "Get in the house," she whispered. "Lock the door." Silas shook his head, slow and steady. No fear in it. No panic, just the kind of no that came from somewhere deep. Somewhere already decided. He moved one step forward, placing himself between her and the railing. Between her and whatever was coming up that drive, his right hand reached behind his back. Under the worn denim jacket with the torn lining she'd noticed when she hung it on the hook by the door last week, Wenner's hand came back. It was holding a revolver. Not a new one. The wooden handle was dark with age, worn smooth in certain places, shaped by a grip that had held it many times before. The metal caught the last light from the sky and threw it back in a dull gleam. Maggie stared at that gun, the man holding it, at those trucks, now close enough that she could count them 3 Ford pickups. One with a cracked windshield, another with a dented passenger door. She'd hired Silas Jones 14 days ago. He'd shown up on foot, carrying nothing but a bedroll, and asking if she needed help with the fall fencing. She'd said yes, because her back hurt and the price was right, and he had kind eyes. She didn't know his real name, didn't know where he came from, didn't know he carried a revolver under his jacket. The truck skidded to a stop, 30 yards out. Dust rolled over them in a wave, glowing red in the headlights, filling the air with grit and the smell of hot engines and burned oil. Doors opened, 3 of them. 4 men stepped out, silhouettes against the light, hats pulled low. One of them spat on the ground, another laughed. Low and ugly dot. The leader walked forward until the porch light caught his face. Maggie's stomach dropped like she'd stepped off a cliff. Lester Hayes, the man who'd shown up 6 months ago with papers and promises, trying to buy her land for pennies on the dollar. The man she'd told no so many times she'd lost count. The man who'd smiled that wet smile and said she'd regret it. He was smiling now. His eyes traveled over her, slow and deliberate, then slid sideways to Silas and stopped. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted, flickered, like a man, recognizing someone he never thought he'd see again. The evening air hung heavy between them, sick with dust and gasoline and something else, something old, something unfinished. Maggie stood frozen on her own porch, the warmth of the day still in the wood beneath her feet, the smell of her stew drifting out through the screen door behind her. She looked at Silas's back, at the quiet way he held himself, at the gun hanging loose at his side, and she realized, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the temperature, that the last 14 days had been leading to this exact moment, that the quiet cowboy who would pine on her porch and never talked about where he'd been had been waiting for something. Maybe waiting for this. Maybe waiting for him. The dust from the trucks still hung in the air, thick enough to taste. Maggie's tongue pressed against the roof of her mouth, dry and gritty, like she'd been chewing on gravel. Her hand was still wrapped around Silas's arm, though she didn't remember keeping it there. Her fingernails had left small crescents in his jacket sleeve. The man with Lester Hayes, the one who'd laughed, spat again. This time she could see him clearly in the porch light. Maybe 30 years old, built thick through the shoulders, with a tattoo curling up the side of his neck, snake or vine, she couldn't tell which. He wore boots that looked new and expensive, and he stood with his weight on his back foot like a man who'd never done a honest day's work in his life. The other 2 hung back by the trucks, spat. One leaned against the dented passenger door, arms crossed. The other walked a slow circle, kicking at tufts of grass, pretending to look at something in the dark. None of them looked worried. Maggie's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her temples, Billy in her throat, behind her eyes. Her lungs still weren't working. Right little sips of air that went nowhere left her dizzy and lightheaded. She pressed her free hand against her chest, as if she could physically slow the pounding. Silas hadn't moved an inch. Not his feet, not his shoulders, nor the hand holding that worn revolver, stood like a fence post sunk deep in concrete. And the stillness of him was somehow louder than the trucks had been. Lester Hayes took another step forward, close enough now that Maggie could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his shirt stuck to his chest in dark patches. Sue's softer than 6 months ago, softer around the middle, softer in the face, but his eyes were the same flat and hard and sure of themselves. "Well now," Lester said, "s'pose rolled out slow, like molasses off a spoon. Isn't this something?" Maggie's throat closed up. She tried to speak and nothing came out. Tried again and managed a sound that wasn't quite a word. Lester ignored her completely, whose eyes stayed locked on Silas. "I said, isn't this something?" Louder this time. Sharper, the man with the tattoo laughed again, the sound too big for the moment, bounced off the barn walls and came back hollow. Silas blinked, that was all, just a slow blink, like a man watching clouds pass. Maggie felt the strangest urge to laugh. The whole situation was so far outside anything she'd experienced in 63 years of living. Debts. Her brain kept trying to file it under dream or mistake or something that will make sense in a minute. But the gravel biting into her bare feet was real. The smell of gasoline and sweat was real. The weight of Silas's arm under her fingers was real. She let go, not because she wanted to, because her fingers had cramped so bad they just opened on their own. She flexed them, watching the blood rush back into the white marks her nails had left. Lester took another step. "You know this man, Maggie, too." He gestured at Silas with one thick hand. "You know who you got standing on your porch?" She didn't. She knew that. Now, with terrible clarity, she knew. He liked his coffee black and his eggs scrambled. She knew. He hummed old hymns while he worked, songs she half remembered from her own childhood. She knew he'd fixed the loose board on the chicken coop without being asked, and that he always turned his hat in his hands before coming through a door. She didn't know his real name, didn't know where he came from, didn't know why a man with kind eyes carried a revolver under his jacket. Lester must have read the answer on her face, because his smile widened. "That's what I figured. Yours did wear your heart where folks could see it. Maggie, that's your problem." The man by the truck stopped his slow circle and drifted closer, too. The one leaning on the dented door straightened up. They moved without hurry, like men with nowhere else to be. Maggie counted them again. 4. Total, counting Lester. 5, if you counted the driver who'd stayed behind the wheel of the middle truck. Engine still running, headlights still blazing. Her land, her home, her porch. 5 men who had no business being here. Standing like they owned every inch of it. Something hot and sharp cut through the fear. Dolly. It only lasted a second, but in that second her spine straightened and her jaw set and she remembered who she was. Margaret Smith. Born in this house 57 years ago, married Jack Smith on this property when she was 19, ferried him behind the old barn 3 years ago last May, raised 2 children here who'd grown and gone and built lives of their own, held this land through drought and flood, and low cattle prices, and the worst kind of loneliness. No man with expensive boots and flat eyes was going to take it from her. That the feeling died as quick as it came, replaced by cold dread, when Lester reached into his back pocket. Beheel only pulled out a folded paper, held it up, so the porch light hit it. "You know what this is, Maggie?" He didn't wait for an answer. "This is a deed, proper and legal. Says, this ranch belongs to me." Now that's a lie. The words came out rough, scraped raw, but they came out. "I never signed nothing, never sold nothing." Lester shrugged. "Don't have to be your signature to be legal. Jets has to look like it." The man with the tattoo laughed again. B's sound grated against Maggie's ears, set her teeth on edge. She wanted to slap him, wanted to scream, wanted to run inside and lock every door and pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, she stood frozen, watching Lester fold the paper and tuck it back in his pocket. "Here's how this goes," Lester said. "Got till the count of 3 to get off my land, Jew, and whoever this fellow is, tack. After that, we start collecting on back taxes in person." The words hung in the air. Back taxes in person. The way he said it, the way his eyes traveled over her as he said it, turned Maggie's blood to ice water. She looked at Silas, really looked at him for the first time since the trucks pulled up. Porch light caught the side of his face, the deep lines around his mouth, the gray stubble on his jaw. Holiday. He looked exactly like what he was, a man in his 60s, with a bad knee and tired eyes. but his hand never wavered. The revolver pointed at the ground, but his finger rested against the trigger guard. And his eyes moved constant and steady, tracking every man in front of him. 1 heartbeat. 2, 3. Lester opened his mouth to start counting, and Silas spoke. His voice came out low and rough, like a drawer stuck halfway open. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, just said 5 words that cut through the night like a blade through warm butter. She's not the one leaving. The man with the tattoo stopped smiling. Lester's mouth closed. Somewhere behind the trucks, an owl called once and went silent. Maggie stared at Silas's back, at the way his shoulders sat square and steady, at the revolver that hadn't moved an inch. And in that moment, she understood something with absolute certainty. She didn't know this man, didn't know his real name or where he came from or what he'd done before he showed up on her road 2 weeks ago. But she knew one thing: the way he'd said those 5 words, the weight in them, the history in them told her everything she needed to know about right now. He wasn't leaving, and somehow, neither was she. The night pressed in around them, dark and thick and full of things unsaid. The headlights still blazed. The truck engine still rumbled. 5 men still stood on her land with bad intentions. But Maggie stopped shaking. She stepped forward. Just enough that her shoulder brushed against Silas's arm. Just enough that anyone watching would know she stood with him, not behind him, with him. Lester saw it. Tease. His eyes flicked between them, calculating, reassessing. The smile didn't come back. Last chance, he said. Berta's voice had changed. Less sure, less smug. Silas didn't answer, didn't move, just stood there, patient as the mountains, still as the grave. The standoff stretched. 1 Mississippi to Mississippi. 3. The man with the tattoo shifted his weight. Gravel crunched loud in the silence. And somewhere, in the darkness beyond the barn, a night bird called again, waiting for an answer that didn't come. The night had gone so quiet, Maggie could hear her own heartbeat, not feel it, hear it, a dull thumping in her ears that kept time with the pulse fluttering in her throat. Third lights from the trucks still blazed, but they seemed dimmer now, like the darkness was pushing back. Lester Hayes stood 20 feet away, his hand resting on his belt, not near a gun. Not yet, just resting there, casual-like, as if he had all the time in the world. The man with the tattoo had stopped shifting his weight. The other 2 had drifted closer, forming a loose half-circle between the trucks and the porch. Maggie counted them again. Still 5, still there, still waiting. Her bare feet had gone numb against the wood planks. That happened sometimes when she got really scared. Her hands and feet would just check out, like they had better places to be. She wiggled her toes just to feel something. The wood was cool now. The day's heat had faded while she wasn't paying attention. Silas hadn't moved since he spoke those 5 words. Whose breathing was so slow, and even she could barely see his shoulders rise and fall. How did a person do that? How did a person stand in front of 5 men with bad intentions and breathe like they were watching clouds? Sir. The answer came to her unbidden, unwelcome practice. That's how a man only got that still, that quiet, if he'd stood in places like this before. Maggie looked at the revolver in his hand, re-looked at it this time, Dwea's fingers wrapped around the worn handle. The way the metal caught the light, the way he held it like it was part of him, like it had grown there. She didn't know this man. The thought hit her harder than it should have, considering she'd known it for the past 20 minutes. This time it landed different. This time, it landed deep, in that place where she kept all her fears about getting old and being alone and making stupid decisions, because the silence got too heavy. 2 weeks, 14 days, Chet. That's how long she'd known him. Heat showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, walking up her driveway, with nothing but a bedroll and a story about Texas. She'd given him supper, the same beef stew she always made, and he'd helped her carry firewood without being asked. By Friday, she'd offered him work. By Sunday, she'd stopped noticing he was there, the way you stop noticing a comfortable chair or a familiar view. Now she stood behind him while 5 men threatened her home, and she had no idea who he really was. The man with the tattoo scratched his neck, right where the snake or vine curled up toward his ear. These is taking too long. Lester held up one hand without looking back. Patience. Patience, nothing. We got what we came for. He gestured at the paper in Lester's pocket. Jets, take it and go. Maggie's stomach turned. They believed it. Those men actually believed that piece of paper meant something. Or maybe they didn't care if it meant something. Maybe they just needed a reason, any reason, to do what they'd come here to do. Lester ignored the tattooed man, as eyes stayed fixed on Silas, narrow and calculating. Behold, I know you, he said slowly. I know your face. Can't place it yet, but I will. Silas said nothing. Give me a minute. Lester tapped his temple with one thick finger. It'll come. Used to be good with faces. Still am. Jets takes a minute sometimes. The seconds stretched. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3. The truck engine rumbled in the background. A steady vibration that Maggie could feel through the porch planks. Somewhere, far off, a coyote yipped twice and fell silent. Maggie's mind raced through options. Throw. The shotgun was in the mudroom, leaning against the wall by the washing machine. But the mudroom was through the kitchen, past the screen door, down the short hall. 2-4. They'd never let her get there. A phone was in her pocket. But who would she call? Sheriff Dawson was 45 minutes away on a good night, and this wasn't a good night. Her children. She thought about them suddenly. Sharply, her daughter in Billings, her son in Denver. Both asleep probably. Both with no idea their mother was standing on her own porch, wondering if she'd see the sunrise. The thought broke something open in her chest. Not fear this time. Something else. Something that felt like grief, but sharper, more immediate. She looked at Silas again. At the back of his head, the gray hair curling over his collar. At his ears, the left one with a small notch in the lobe she'd never noticed before. At his shoulders, broad and steady under the worn denim jacket. Who was she to ask him to die for her dirt? The question came out of nowhere and landed like a punch. She didn't ask it out loud, didn't whisper it, but it echoed in her head, louder than her heartbeat, louder than the truck engine, louder than the silence pressing in from all sides. This wasn't his fight, This wasn't his land, This wasn't his home. He'd walked into this 2 weeks ago, looking for honest work and a place to rest. And now, he stood between her and men who'd come to take everything, too, holding a revolver that spoke of a past she couldn't begin to imagine. She could run. The thought arrived quiet and quick, slipping through like a snake through grass. She could run. Dittrek was parked around the side of the house, keys in the ignition like always. If she moved fast enough, if they were focused on Silas, she could make it. Drive to town, find Sheriff Dawson, come back, with help. Leave Silas here alone. Her stomach lurched. She pressed a hand against it, felt the heat of her own skin through her shirt. Leaving, let him face 5 men by himself, while she ran for help that might come too late or not at all. But what other choice was there? What other option made any kind of sense? Lester snapped his fingers. Gutted. The word hung in the air. Silas didn't react, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. Just a fraction, just enough for Maggie to notice. Sweetwater. Lester said it like a door opening. Sweetwater County, 4,987. You were a deputy. Maggie's breath caught. She looked at Silas. Really looked at him, trying to see the younger man he must have been. A deputy. Law enforcement, debts. Why he knew how to stand still. That's why he knew how to hold a gun. That was a long time ago. Lester continued. Before everything went sideways. Before the thing with the rancher and the missing money and that girl who swore she saw something she shouldn't have. Silas's jaw tightened. Just once. Just a flicker. But Maggie saw it. You left town fast after that, Lester said. Rio. Fast. Changed your name. I'm guessing. Grew a beard. Got old. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. I remember now. I remember everything. The tattooed man looked between them, confused. What's he talking about? Lester waved him off. Nothing you need to know. Just An old story about an old lawman who couldn't keep his nose where it belonged. He took a step closer, close enough that Maggie could see the sweat on his upper lip. That's who you got standing here, Maggie, a disgraced deputy who ran away from a mess he helped create. There's your protection. Maggie's mind reeled. Sweetwater County. It's 1987. A rancher and missing money and a girl who saw something. She'd didn't know what any of it meant, didn't know if it was true, or just Lester twisting things to hurt. But Silas didn't deny it, didn't say a word, just stood there, still as stone. Holding that revolver like it was the only thing keeping him upright, Lester spread his hands wide. Here's the thing, you've got two choices. Maggie, you can stay here with a man who already ran away once, a man who left people behind when things got hard, or you can walk away now. Let us handle our business and go back to whatever life you've got left. The words landed hard. Maggie felt them in her chest, in her throat, in the sudden burning behind her eyes. She looked at Silas, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to deny it, explain it, give her some reason to believe. He said nothing, and in that silence, something shifted. The ground beneath her feet felt less solid, the porch less familiar, the man in front of her less known. The tattooed man laughed again, but it sounded different this time, softer, almost sympathetic. Told you, this was taking too long. Lester ignored him. He was watching Maggie now, reading her face like a book. Last chance, he said. Walk away, save yourself. This isn't your fight anymore. Maggie looked at her home, the chipped blue door, the potted geraniums by the steps, their flowers closed for the night, the porch swing, where she'd sat with Jack 1,000 evenings, watching the sun go down over land they'd built together. Then she looked at Silas, at the man who'd fixed her chicken coop and hummed old hymns, and never once mentioned Sweetwater County, or 1987, or anything that came before. She opened her mouth to speak. And then Silas realized that his hope for a quiet, anonymous end was a lie. The silence after Silas's realization stretched thin as spider silk. One word could break it, one move, one breath, but nobody moved, nobody spoke. The night held its breath right along with them. Maggie stood frozen, caught between running and staying, between the man she'd known for 2 weeks and the home she'd known for 63 years. Her legs trembled, her hands shook, but her feet stayed planted on the porch wood, rooted there by something she couldn't name. Lester watched her with those flat, hard eyes, saw her hesitation, saw her uncertainty, and his smile returned, slow and confident. That's right, he said softly. Think about it, really think. You don't know this man, you don't know what he did, don't know who he left behind when things got hot in Sweetwater. But me, you know me, Maggie, You know I'm a businessman. You know I play fair when people play fair with me. The tattooed man snickered. The other two shifted closer, emboldened by Maggie's silence. By the way, she hadn't moved or spoken or done anything to stop them. Silas still hadn't turned around, still hadn't looked at her. His back was a wall, broad and steady, but walls crumbled. Walls, spores left you exposed when they came down. Maggie thought about Jack, about the way he'd stand between her and trouble, never asking if she wanted him to, just doing it because that's who he was. She thought about the day they buried him, how she'd stood at the grave and promised herself she'd be strong, strong enough to keep the land, strong enough to carry on, strong enough to face whatever came alone. She hadn't been alone for 2 weeks. That was the thing. That was the part she hadn't admitted until now. Silas's quiet presence had filled something she'd learned to live without. Not romance, nothing like that. Just company, day. Just another person breathing the same air, drinking the same coffee, watching the same sun go down. And now that presence might cost him everything. The realization hit her like ice water. She'd been thinking about herself this whole time. Her fear, her choices, her land. But Silas was the one standing in front of 5 men. Silas was the one holding a revolver he clearly hoped he wouldn't have to use. Silas was the one whose past had just been dragged into the light for strangers to pick over. She looked at the back of his head, at two grey hair curling over his collar, at his ears. The left one with that small knot she'd never noticed before, at his shoulders. Still square, still steady, still planted between her and trouble. He hadn't moved since Lester started talking about Sweetwater. Hadn't flinched, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything except stand there, solid as the mountains, while his secrets spilled across her porch like dirty water. Why? 3. Why would a man do that? Why would a man stay when every word out of Lester's mouth gave him reason to run? Thus, the answer came to her quiet and quick, like light through a crack in the door. Because he'd run before. Because he'd lived with that decision for 36 years. Because standing still, even when it cost him, was the only way to become someone different. Maggie's trembling stopped. Not all at once, not dramatic like in movies, just slowly, gradually. The shaking in her hands eased and her legs steadied and her breathing evened out. She stepped forward, not away from Silas, not toward the trucks, not toward escape. Forward, one step that brought her shoulder against his arm, solid and warm through his denim jacket. Silas didn't look at her, but she felt something shift in him, a tiny release of tension. So small she might have imagined it. Lester's smile flickered. He said her name like a warning. Last chance. Walk away now, and nobody gets hurt. She didn't answer him. Instead, she looked at Silas, really looked at him, at the profile of his face in the porch light, at the deep lines around his mouth, and the grey stubble on his jaw, and the eyes that never stopped moving, tracking every man in front of them. I don't know what happened in Sweetwater, she said quietly. 2. I don't know if what he said is true, or just stories, but I know you fix my chicken coop without being asked. I know you hum hymns while you work. I know you turn your hat in your hands before you come through a door. She paused. I know. You're still standing here? Silas's jaw tightened. Just once. Just a flicker, but she saw it. Lester took a step forward. Enough of this. The tattooed man matched him. Step for step, the other two closed in. 5 men, loose and confident, spreading out like they'd done this before. Light. They knew how it ended. Maggie's heart hammered, but her feet stayed planted. Silas spoke, too. His voice came out low and rough, meant for her alone. Should go inside. No. Margaret, her full name. Thee'd never called her that before. This isn't your fight. She almost laughed. Almost the sound caught in her throat and came out as something between a cough and a sob. This is my porch. My land. My home. She looked at the men spreading out in front of her. Delete. That makes it my fight. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then, so soft she barely heard it. You don't know what I've done. Don't care. You should don't. She said it firm. Final. The same voice she used when cattle needed moving or fences needed mending. I know what I see. That's enough. The tattooed man had circled around to the side now, angling toward the edge of the porch. The other two spread wider, cutting off any path to the truck, to the barn, to escape. They moved, like men who'd done this before, like men who knew exactly how to box someone in. Lester pulled a revolver from his belt. Maggie saw it happen in pieces, the glint of metal, the way his hand wrapped around the grip, the slow lift as he brought it up. Her body went cold. Then hot, then cold again. Silas didn't flinch, didn't raise his own gun, just watched, patient as stone, while Lester leveled the barrel at his chest. Last chance, Lester said. Both of you, walk away now and we forget this happened. The tattooed man had reached the edge of the porch, close, enough that Maggie could smell his cologne chip and sharp, covering something sour underneath, too. He grinned at her, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco. Come on, old woman, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Something snapped, not loud, not dramatic, jet. A quiet breaking inside Maggie, a release of all the fear and doubt and uncertainty that had held her frozen for the past hour. She looked at that stained grin, at those flat eyes, at the man who thought she was old and weak and useless, and she remembered who she was. You listen to me. Her voice cut through the night like a blade. The tattooed man's grin faltered. "This is my land, my family's land for 3 generations. My grandfather homesteaded this place in 1912. My daddy built that barn with his own 2 hands. My husband and I raised 2 children in that house and buried one behind that barn when she came too soon and didn't stay." She stepped forward, off the porch, onto the gravel, bare feet against sharp stones. "I didn't feel a thing. You think I'm scared of you, free. I think I'm scared of your trucks and your guns and your paper that ain't worth the ink on it." She laughed then, real and sharp and unexpected. "I've survived drought that cracked the earth open. I've survived blizzards that buried the cattle standing up. I survived losing my husband and my baby girl and watching my children move away because there wasn't nothing here for them anymore." Another step, closer to Lester, close, enough to see the confusion flickering behind his eyes. "You want this land, Jew. Come take it. But you better be ready to carry me off it first, because I ain't walking." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, the truck engine seemed to fade, just a distant rumble beneath the weight of her words. Silas moved. Not fast, not dramatic, jet. A single step that brought him even with her, shoulder to shoulder. 2 old people standing on gravel in the dark, facing down 5 men with bad intentions. The revolver in his hand hadn't risen, still pointed at the ground. I bet something in the way he held it had changed. It looked less like a weapon now, and more like a promise. Lester stared at them, at Maggie, barefoot and fierce in the headlights, at Silas, quiet and still beside her, at the space between them, solid as any wall. His finger rested against the trigger. One squeeze, toe. That's all it would take. The night bird called again from beyond the barn. Closer this time. Waiting. The man with the yellow shoes. Maggie noticed them suddenly, bright and out of place in the dust spat on the ground, and shifted his weight. Gravel crunched, loud in the silence. Lester's eyes flicked toward the sound, just for a second, just a fraction of a moment. But Silas saw it, and in that fraction of a moment, in that tiny crack of distraction, everything shifted, the air changed, the balance tipped. The standoff, that had stretched for an hour, suddenly felt like it could end in the next heartbeat. Maggie felt it too, felt the moment teetering on the edge of something irreversible, felt the weight of every choice she'd ever made gathering in her chest, pushing her forward, telling her that this right here, right now was the moment that would define everything that came after. Lester's eyes snapped back to them, his fingers still on the trigger, his jaw tight. "Last chance," he said again, but his voice cracked on the words. Just a little, just enough. Silas looked at Maggie. Rhea looked at her, full in the face, for the first time since the trucks arrived. His eyes held something she couldn't name: regret, maybe, or gratitude, or goodbye. Then he looked back at Lester and moved. The sky turned slow above the Montana prairie, purple bleeding into pink, pink fading to gold along the edges of the eastern hills. Morning came gentle, the way it always did in September, like the sun wasn't quite ready to let go of night. On the porch of the Circle M Ranch, a single piece of pine lay where it had fallen hours ago. Next to it, a small knife caught the first light, metal gleaming soft and warm. Curls of wood surrounded them both, pale against the weathered gray boards, light snow that forgot to melt. The gravel driveway sat empty. 3 sets of tire tracks cut through the dust, deep and sharp at first, then fainter, then gone where they curved toward the county road. No trucks, no headlights, slow. No men with flat eyes and bad intentions, just tracks that would wash away with the next rain, erase themselves like they'd never been there at all. Baggy stood in the kitchen, her hand wrapped around a coffee cup so tight her knuckles showed white. The ceramic had gone cold 10 minutes ago. She hadn't noticed, hadn't taken a sip, just stood there staring through the window at the driveway. At the emptiness, at the impossible fact that she was still standing in her own kitchen at all. Her bare feet remembered the gravel, the sharp stones, the cold. She'd washed them in the mudroom sink an hour ago. Picked out 3 small pebbles wedged between her toes. But she could still feel it, would probably feel it for days. The clock on the wall read 6:17 a.m., September 13th, 2023. 14 hours since the sun went down, a lifetime since the trucks appeared. She heard the porch steps creak. Then, nothing, just the silence of someone sitting down, Slow, careful, letting a bad knee bend at its own pace. Maggie set the cold coffee in the sink, poured it out, watched the brown liquid swirl and disappear. Then, she reached for the pot, still warm on the stove, and filled 2 clean mugs. Black for him, 1 sugar for her. It's the way it had been every morning for 2 weeks. The screen door squeaked when she pushed it open. Same squeak it had made for 20 years, ever since Jack said he'd oil it and never got around to it. She'd thought about fixing it herself 100 times. Never did. Some things you keep broken because the brokenness feels like company. Silas sat on the top step, right where he'd been when the trucks first appeared. His back was to her, same as before, but everything else had changed. Her shoulders weren't square and steady now. They slumped forward, just a little, like a man carrying something heavy that he couldn't set down. The revolver was gone. DeVay, back under his jacket, probably, or tucked away somewhere she couldn't see. The pine lay beside him, untouched since last night. The knife sat next to it, blade closed. Patient. Maggie crossed the porch. The wood planks felt different under her feet. No, cool and familiar and impossibly precious. She'd walked this porch 10,000 times. Never once thought about what it would feel like to walk it for the last time. She sat down beside him, toes close enough that their shoulders almost touched, slows close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, the slow rhythm of his breathing. She held out the mug. Silas looked at it, her hand wrapped around the ceramic, the steam rising between them. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Jets looked like the mug was something foreign, something he'd never seen before. Then, his hand reached out, slow, careful, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic, and he nodded. Jets, a tiny dip of his chin, just enough. They sat like that for a while, drinking coffee, watching the sun climb over the hills, listening to the birds wake up in the cottonwoods by the creek. The world going about its business like nothing had happened. Because to the world, nothing had. Maggie thought about asking, too. The question sat on her tongue, heavy as a stone. What happened after I couldn't see? Raph, after the gravel stopped crunching and the headlights went dark and you told me to stay inside. Through question pressed against her teeth, begging to be spoken. She didn't ask it. Some things you don't need to know. Some things you're better off not knowing. And some things, maybe the most important things, get told without words. In the way a man sits quiet beside you, drinking coffee he didn't have to accept. Silas set his mug down on the step, reached for the pine, picked it up, turned it over in his hands, studied it like it held answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. You should know, he said. Who? His voice came out rough, scraped raw, about Sweetwater. But what happened? Maggie shook her head. Don't need to know. Maybe you do. Maybe you got it right. She thought about it, really thought about 1987, and a deputy and a rancher and missing money, and a girl who saw something. About the weight of a past you couldn't shake, no matter how far you ran or how long you stayed quiet. I got a right to know who you are now, she said finally. The rest is just stories. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then, the knife opened with a soft click, and he started whittling again, slow strokes. Careful. Curls of pine falling around his boots, like small prayers. They sat like that as the sun climbed higher, him whittling, her watching. The silence between them, comfortable now, worn smooth as river stones. After a while, Maggie noticed what he was making. Not a whistle or a toy or any of the things men usually wear. It was a flower, small and delicate, with petals curling outward and a stem that tapered to a point. A wild rose, maybe, or something close to it. He worked slow, patient, the way he did everything, and steady as stone last night. Trembled just a little now. From cold or exhaustion or something else. She couldn't tell. The tattooed man's face flashed through her mind. The stained grin, the flat eyes. He'd circled toward the porch like a wolf testing fence. She pushed the image away. Not now. Not here. Not in this morning light, with coffee warm in her chest. And a man whittling beside her. The truck keys hung on their hook by the door. She could drive to town, call Sheriff Dawson, file a report, start the long process of making last night official, making it real, making it something the law would have to notice. She didn't move. Some things you handle yourself. Some things you let the law handle. And some things, maybe the most important things, you just let be. Because dragging them into the light tears something bigger than it heals. Silas finished the flower, held it up, turned it in the light, examined it from every angle. Then he held it out to her, casual-like, as if he offered carved flowers to women every day. Maggie took it. The wood was smooth under her fingers, warm from his hands, small and delicate and impossibly detailed. A wild rose, frozen forever in the moment before it bloomed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, picked up his coffee, took a sip, made a face because it had gone cold, set it back down. The sun cleared the hills completely, flooding the prairie with golden light. A touch, the chipped blue door behind them, the geraniums by the steps, the tire tracks fading in the driveway. A touch, their faces warming skin that had gone cold in the night, reminding them both that the world kept turning whether they were ready or not. Maggie turned the flower over in her hands, thought about her mother, who'd loved wild roses, thought about her daughter, who'd never got to see one, thought about all the things you lose and all the things you find and the strange way they fit together in the end. "I got more fencing needs mending," she said, "if you're staying." Silas didn't answer right away. He picked up another piece of pine, smaller this time, rougher, and started working on it. Curls fell. The knife moved. The morning stretched on, easy and warm. "I'm staying," he said. 2 words, quiet as breath, but Maggie heard them, felt them, settle somewhere deep, somewhere that had been hollow for 3 years. She looked out at her land, these same hills and fields and cottonwoods by the creek, the same barn her daddy built, the same house her granddad homesteaded, the same sky that had watched over every joy and every sorrow this place had ever known. It felt different now, not because anything had changed, because she had. The fear that had lived in her chest since Jack died, the quiet hum of worry that kept her checking locks and watching driveways hadn't vanished, but it had moved over, made room for something else, something that felt like roots going deeper, like foundations settling, like a woman remembering she was made of tougher stuff than she'd given herself credit for. Silas kept whittling. She kept watching, too. The coffee cooled in their mugs. The birds kept singing. Somewhere down by the creek, a cow lowed once, twice, then fell silent. Maggie thought about Lester Hayes, about the paper in his pocket, and the flat look in his eyes, about the way he'd said last chance like he believed it. Thought about the tattooed man and the one with yellow shoes and the others whose faces she barely remembered. She thought about Silas, about Sweetwater and 1987, and all the things she'd never ask, about the way he'd stood between her and trouble, not because she asked him to, not because it was his fight, but because that's who he'd decided to become. The flower sat in her palm, small and perfect, a wild rose that would never wilt, a promise carved in pine. She smiled, not big, not dramatic, just a small curve at the corners of her mouth, the kind that crept up when you weren't looking, the kind that surprised you by showing up at all. Silas glanced over, saw it, looked away quick, but not quick enough to hide the tiny shift in his own expression. Something that might have been a smile, if you squinted, might have been the light, might have been both. The morning stretched on, golden and warm, too. People on a porch, drinking cold coffee and not talking. A carved flower passed between them like a secret. Tire tracks fading in the driveway. A chipped blue door standing open behind them, waiting for whatever came next. Maggie took a sip of her coffee, made a face, laughed, just a little, at herself for drinking cold coffee when there was hot waiting inside. She didn't get up, didn't move, just sat there in the sun, on her porch, with a quiet man beside her and a wooden flower in her hand. The land stretched out before her, the same land, all 160 acres of it. Her grandfather's dream, her father's sweat, her mother's tears, her Jack's blood and bone, buried behind the barn where the wild roses grew in spring. Hers, still hers, maybe always hers. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough.